Yes, the Sabbath groups were right through from France into Spain, and they were aggregations of varying groups of Christians. So, at the very least, some of these groups appeared to be Sabbath keepers in these early times, but also were persecuted for keeping the biblical holy days. And this must be inferred from the edicts about them. They put in, these people were doing these sort of things to have them arrested. Right. So they're obviously doing those sorts of things.
You're right, to have
to warrant their arrest. Right. So that's always a very clear direction. And these in the 1200s we're leading into the Inquisitions and the Albigensian Crusades, and we'll deal with that later on. And the problems that dealt with these, with the Spanish systems, are covered by Roth in the Spanish Inquisitions, and there are pages 35 to 36 where comments are made about these Inquisitions and what they were being persecuted for. Now, there were biblical literasts, and the Waldensians were biblical literasts who were subordinationist terms incorrectly Arians.
Right.
And you get to these mindless Trinitarians and say, oh, the Arian heresy, and there's no idea of the history of the churches and what the disputes were about, and they simply don't get it. Now, the non-Trinitarians in Spain were identified with the Jews in their habits and non-Trinitarianism, although by the later inquisitorial edict of 1519 by Andres de Palacio, the Christian sects were largely dispersed or completely underground. And you see Roth, page 77, for the edict. We published that in one of the texts. The Waldensians, it's published in the text of 170, the Sabbath, the Roll of the Fourth Commandment paper. Right. The Waldensians elsewhere in Italy after the Reformation, on the other hand, who appear to have become Trinitarian, and the later history written by the Protestants and somewhat self-justificatory, seem to deny the earlier history of biblical literalism. In 1237, Pope Gregory IX sent a bull to the Archbishop of Tarragona, which resulted in 15 of the heretics being burnt. King Ferdinand himself casting wood on the fire. In the course of time, these Spanish Waldensians were exterminated, so said Adini. The Waldensians were as widespread as Germany, where their church sent candidates for the ministry to a Waldensian college in Milan. The head of the college was John of Ronco, who was appointed head for life, despite Waldo's disapproval. It was this fact that resulted in the division between the French group and the Italian group and the German group. The Lombards appointed their own chief pastor, though propositus. He and their ministry held office for life, while Waldo and the French Waldensians, on his authority, elected annual leaders to administer the Lord's Supper and serve as pastors. Thus, we can establish that we are dealing with a group which at the 13th century were keeping the Lord's Supper on an annual basis. The suggestion that they were Sunday worshippers at this time is impossible to sustain. It's incorrect, false.
Yeah.
The extraordinary problems faced in this matter is that of the existence of the Albigensians in the northern and French side of the Alps. The southern and Italian valleys were occupied by the Waldensians. From the division mentioned above, it's most probable that the names being conferred by the Catholic inquisitors assumed a reality of their own. The edicts in Spain, however, show that we're dealing with the same sect, and the subsequent division would have assumed a different reality when the sect became Protestant Trinitarian. Bohemia, 40 years after Waldo died, according to the Inquisitor of Passau, had 42 so-called nests of heresy. Adini upset. The king, Ottokar, started persecution, which was most severe under Pope Benedict XII in 1335. And the rise of the Hussite movement resulted in a fusion of some of the two groups under the name Taborites. And Adini holds that the most famous of these was the Barbe Friedrich Reiser. After 25 years among the Waldensians of Bohemia and Austria, he was burnt at Strasbourg in 1458. There are thus at least 4 groups over some 8 countries, some of which were integrated with Protestants. There were subordinationists or Unitarians in Austria in the 13th century, and the Inquisitor of Krems denounced 36 localities in 1315, burning 130 martyrs. The Bishop of Neumeister was burnt as one of these heretics in Vienna. He is said to have declared that there were some 80,000 Waldensians in the Duchy of Austria. This is in the 1300s.
Wow, that's a lot, isn't it?
That's a lot. A major section of the population.
Yeah.
At the end of the 14th century, there was a terrible persecution in Styria. There was an organised mission into Italy from Austria, where the missionaries travelled as peddlers. The movement had a college in Milan where Waldo was alive. From these points, it is difficult to assert, as Adini seems to, that the subordinations in Austria were Waldenses, given that the evangelism was from Austria into Italy. The bishop was more likely of the same group later named Waldenses. The group were also called Sabbatati and then subsequently Insabbatati, which allegedly is derived from the wooden sabots or shoes that were worn. It's more likely a corruption of their views on the Sabbath turned into a play on words. This then developed into the terms sabotiers and sandaliati. So, says Weber in the Catholic Encyclopedia, he fails to note the linguistic distinction between the words and in fact intermixes them in their order so as to confirm his position. He also asserts that the sect was derived from Waldo, ignoring almost completely the evidence mentioned by Adini. Perhaps more information was available to Adini, but the bias in Weber's work is noticeable and understandable given the history. So the Waldensians are forbidden to preach by the Archbishop, and they are alleged to have appealed to the Third Lateran Council under Alexander III, although they have been condemned from above before the council in 1179. They had been summoned to the examination. It must be remembered in those days that the medieval system ensured that the states were the property of their lords under direction from Rome, and it was not possible to hold any belief not in accordance with Rome. Hence they had to appear as summoned, even though they accorded no allegiance to Rome, and not to do so was to be burnt in any case. There's nothing fair about these systems run by the Trinitarians. Another vital division among the Waldensians occurred from the teaching of the Italian Waldensians that the sacraments administered by unworthy priests were of no effect. The French did not accept this view. The Italians repudiated all the sacraments of the Roman priests and at the same time insisted on close adhesion to New Testament teachings. This division was discussed at a conference in May 1217, the year of Waldo's death. The two branches of Waldensians established contact over time, but we clearly have extensive division and the existence in France of one group coexisting with the Albigensians. In the 15th century, Inquisition records reveal there was a large and influential number of Waldensians in central Italy. In Calabria, the Waldensians from Piedmont won over most of the district. They flourished for 250 years, after which they were almost exterminated by wholesale persecution. The French system of church government, despite Waldo, was episcopal, whereas the Italian was Presbyterian, being comprised of a church government of a council, with a head pastor and a council of laymen. The annual synod comprised elders and laity in equal numbers. The Waldensians gradually became centred on the valleys on the Italian side of the Cottian Alps. Thus Vaudois was asserted to be a geographical name. Adonai denies this and admits that the name Walda derives from the poor men of Lyon, and thus the early stages are, without doubt, admitted to be general across the Alps and thus exposed to and associated with the Albigensians. It is highly improbable that the subordinationist sects, incorrectly termed Manichaeans by the Catholics, could have spread from the Balkans across Austria and into France and Spain and somehow bypassed the Alps and the Waldensians who occupied similar regions. Impossible. The most likely solution is that the Waldensians changed under persecution and became Protestant to survive. After they ceased to be subordinationist, it is little wonder that they held Sunday worship. Indeed, their later historians claim that they were always so. In the 15th century, the valleys came under intense persecution from the Duke of Savoy, with large numbers being forced to emigrate in 1434. In 1475, the Inquisitor Acquapendente, after visiting the Lucena Valley, compelled the overlords to suppress the rebellion there and obey the Inquisition. There was a consequent rebellion which led to the intervention of Duke Charles I in 1484. And the first serious attack with armed forces occurred under Philip II, the Regent of Savoy, in 1490 and Duke of Savoy in 1496. In 1494, whereupon Philip was so disastrously defeated he made peace with them for 40 years. Adonai admits that it is not easy to be clear as to the theological views of the Waldensians during this period. He says, when we do meet with the Waldensian statement of beliefs, this is subsequent to the Reformation and characterised by doctrines and phrases distinctive of that movement. The early Protestantism was partly negative in the rejection of Roman Catholic teachings and practices which could not be justified by the New Testament, and insofar as it was positive, a return to the simplicity and spirituality of worship believed to have been characteristic of the primitive church. Adonai, page 668. So when the Reformation broke out, the only organised groups on the continent were the Waldensians and the later Hussites or Bohemian Brethren, both of whom the Protestants and Roman Catholics designated as Waldensians. Thus, the application of these names is inaccurate, even as late as the Reformation. The doctrines of the early periods cannot be established with certainty. However, there is no doubt that they were subordinationist Unitarians classified as Arians, and though they kept the Lord's Supper, this practice normally was associated with Sabbath keepers. It is, however, the practice of Sunday worshipping Protestants to sometimes refer to the Eucharist as the Lord's Supper, assuming that the practice was used in its usual reference. Then logically, the understanding of the Sabbath is prior to that of the Passover Lord's Supper. The texts above identify them as Sabbath keepers. Adonai would probably not have misunderstood the terms Lord's Supper. The Waldensians held a synod in Piedmont in 1531 to discuss the report of the Protestant doctrines by George Morel. They divided over the issue of whether to accept Protestantism. The two groups were termed conservators and innovators. You see it in any note on page 668. There is thus no doubt that their original doctrines were not Protestant. From this time onwards they merged with the Protestants, and the denial of Rome and medieval ritual, which was regarded as idolatrous, spirituality of worship, and the use of scripture in the vernacular were Waldensian views which found a welcome support from the powerful new Protestant reformers. From 1532 and the Synod of Champhorans at Angrogne, a number of reforms took place. That is, 1, the adoption of public worship by the Waldensian churches instead of secret meetings. They all had to meet secretly until this time. 2. An absolute condemnation of the custom of some Waldensians of attending Roman Catholic services. There seems little doubt that this grew out of fear of persecution. See also Revelation 2:20-22. 3. An acceptance of the Reformers' views on predestination, good works, oaths, the denial of obligatory confession, Sunday fasts, marriage of the clergy, and the 2 sacraments. The matters were voted on by the Assembly and carried by the great majority. The Waldensians on the French side of the Alps, who were mostly conservatives, were fused into French Protestantism. Persecution in Bohemia and southern Italy nearly exterminated the churches of the Waldensians in those parts, leaving only Piedmont and the Italian valleys of the Cottian Alps, termed the Vaudois country, as the only important habitat, although there were many scattered among the Swiss and German Protestants. In 1536, Piedmont came under the dominion of the French Francis I, which lasted until 1559. William of Furstenberg, a resolute Protestant, was appointed governor and was friendly to the Waldensians. He left the brother of the reformer Farel in charge of the Lucerne, and the Waldensians prospered, but they were nevertheless by this time well and truly Protestant. It's thus very misleading to say they were always Sunday worshippers, because they were not even Trinitarians until after the 14th century, and only then on persecution. In fact, that may not have occurred until the Reformation. The practice of meeting in secret no doubt was prompted by intense persecution. The inherent flexibility with which they viewed their religious life and their strictness regarding the biblical simplicity of it no doubt reflected this also. Similarly, the history is written by Sunday-worshipping Trinitarian Protestants who were attempting to develop a continuous Protestant lineage back to the Apostles. They did not want a subordinationist organisation keeping the Lord's Supper, which was the fact of the matter. But also the earlier manuscripts were not available to Mouston, for example. The Waldensians were persecuted for many years, the worst period from 1540 to 1690. In 1534 in Provence there was a wholesale destruction of the Waldensian churches of Provence. The Italian side of the Alps was subjected to intense warfare by Della Trinate, the army commander for Philibert, Duke of Savoy. The Waldensians won and were granted peace on 5th June 1561. The Calabrian Waldensians were persecuted by Spanish troops under the Inquisitor Michel Ghislieri, later Pope Pius V. The descendants of those not wiped out in the wholesale slaughter of the 13th century were persecuted. 2,000 were put to death and 1,600 imprisoned. In the Piedmont, under Jesuit and Capuchin friars, with the aid of soldiers, several local persecutions occurred, with seizure of church buildings and fines, resulting in the bloody war of 1624, in which both sides suffered. Peter Gilles was the leader at that time. There was a great persecution under Louis XIV, when the young Charles Emmanuel II became Duke of Savoy. His mother, Mary de' Medici, was daughter of Henry IV and granddaughter of Catherine de' Medici, the author of the massacre of St. Bartholomew. A council for the propagation of the faith was established at Turin. 5 years later, the decree of Castado was issued, ordering all the Waldensian families on the plain back into the mountains within 20 days, unless they would renounce Protestantism. In the depths of winter, they endured much suffering with great courage. It was a tactical ploy, as some 15,000 troops were dispatched to La Torre in spite of the fact that the Waldensians took to the mountains. The Catholic forces offered to treat with them, and they opened the mountain passes to them. They were subject to wholesale massacre, and there were some 1,712 martyrs numbered by Jean Leger, the author of A History of the Waldensians. It's noted by Dini on page 670. This massacre, before the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, shocked Europe. Cromwell proclaimed a fast. He had Milton draw up a letter to the King of France and to the Protestant princes. He sent Sir Samuel Morland to the Duke of Savoy in protest. Cromwell's intervention had an effect. Mazarin directed the Duke to put an end to the persecution and grant the Protestants amnesty. In 1686, the year after the Edict of Nantes, Louis XIV sent a letter to his cousin Victor Amadeus II, Duke of Savoy, requesting that he persecute the Waldensians as he was persecuting the Huguenots, as they were taking refuge among the Waldensians. So the Huguenots were not Waldensians. You see that? When the persecution commenced, the Swiss Protestants at Basel intervened, offering the Waldensians exile in Switzerland. The Swiss envoys managed with great difficulty to persuade the Waldensians to accept this exile. On 9th of April 1686, the Duke signed a decree permitting the exile. However, in spite of this, some who had accepted exile were seized and imprisoned. The Waldensians resisted after this breach of the terms. War commenced, and by the end of the year, 9,000 were killed and 12,000 were taken prisoner, many of whom died in the Piedmont dungeons. There were some 200 left in the mountains, and they conducted such persistent guerrilla warfare that they finally obtained the release of all the surviving prisoners and their safe conduct to Switzerland. 3,000 survivors were released in 1687. They set off across the Alps for Geneva, an average 12-day journey, and many perished in the snow. This was done despite the Swiss protest, and children under 12 were detained to be educated as Roman Catholics. They were dispersed as far as Brandenburg, Prussia, Württemberg, and the Palatinate to prevent their attempts to return. The Waldensians regained control of their homeland by an invasion mounted from Switzerland, with some 1,000 men on 16th of August 1689. In the valley of the Gelon, after 6 days' march, they defeated a force of some 2,500 French troops under the Marquis de Lary. The French lost 600 and the Waldensians lost 15 and 12 wounded, although they lost 116 on the way. The Waldensians fought from La Basiglia and carried out mountain warfare over the spring of 1690. Remember, these people are fighting for their very survival, and we have had to suffer persecution and this fighting warfare over 2,000 years. On 23rd of May 1694, they were granted religious liberty by decree of Victor. Pope Innocent XII denounced the edict, whereupon the Senate in Turin repudiated the papal decree and forbade publication of it in the duchy under penalty of death. They would have been in severe hardship had it not been for the assistance of England and Holland. William and Mary and late Queen Anne assisted them warmly, as Cromwell had done in previous years. And that was so, and that Sir Thomas Cox actually turned over his wharves and took all the Palatinate Protestants into the wharves on the Thames under Queen Anne, and for which he was knighted by Queen Anne for his generosity and services to the Palatinate Christians. Now, the history of the Waldensians is one of severe and intermittent oppression over the remaining centuries. They are of little relation to the churches of God, and they have long since given up the distinctive subordinationism and other characteristics of the church. But they are of interest in noting how the papacy dealt with non-Catholics when they had the power to act. Had they been able, they would have killed every single Waldensian until they had exterminated them from the face of the earth.
Right. And nothing's really changed, has it?
No.
No,
Still try it.
they're just leaving it.
If they could, they would do what the same thing to us tomorrow, only worse.
Right, yep, and they'll be waking up again soon, won't they, for the beast system?
Yes. Now we'll deal with the Albigensian Crusade and the other aspects into Britain in this next section.